The morning Priscilla Payne told the town of Redstone Flats that she was leaving. The air inside the general store hung so thick with dust and silence that a man could have choked on either one. She stood in the center of the room with her chin raised and her hands steady at her sides, and every soul in that building went utterly still. The widow Hargrove clutching her tin of coffee, old Dexter Finch with his thumb frozen mid-page in the Sears catalog, and young Tommy Alcott, who had stopped sweeping mid-stroke and was now leaning on his broom like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "I have made my decision," Priscilla said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her was. "I am leaving Redstone Flats. I have already written to my cousin in Denver. I have already settled my accounts with Mr. Finch. I am going, and I wanted to say goodbye properly because you all deserve that much." The silence stretched another 3 full seconds, and then the door to the general store swung open. Sheriff Samuel Colt stepped through it the way he always did, unhurried, filling the frame completely, his dark hat casting a long shadow across the floorboards. He had clearly been passing by on his morning rounds when the unusual quiet from inside the store had drawn his attention. His brown eyes swept the room once, reading it the way only a man trained to read dangerous rooms could, and then they settled on Priscilla Payne and stayed there. "What is happening in here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already had a fairly good idea. It was Tommy Alcott, with all the subtlety of a boy who had not yet learned to keep his mouth closed, who answered first. "Miss Payne says she is leaving Redstone Flats, Sheriff, for good." Samuel Colt did not move. He did not reach for the brim of his hat, or shift his weight, or do any of the dozen small things a man does when he is merely absorbing ordinary news. He just looked at Priscilla, and something in his expression changed in a way that was so private and so painful that Widow Hargrove later told her sister it made her want to look away out of common decency. "Over my watch," Samuel said quietly, not loudly, not as a shout or a proclamation. He said it the way a man says something he means all the way down to the bone. "You are not leaving this town, Priscilla Payne, not like this, not under these circumstances." Priscilla's chin lifted another fraction of an inch. "You have no authority over where I choose to go, Samuel Colt." "No," he agreed just as quietly. "I have no legal authority over it, but I have a right to ask you to stop, and I am asking." And that was where everything truly began. Or rather, that was where everything that had been quietly, desperately unraveling for the past 8 months finally came fully into the open. 8 months earlier, Redstone Flats, Colorado had been the kind of town that kept its secrets the way dry earth keeps water, poorly and briefly. The year was 1882. And the town sat at the eastern edge of the Rockies in a valley that turned golden every autumn and brutal every winter, with a population of just over 300 souls who all knew each other's business and most of each other's sins. It had a single main street, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a saloon called the Copper Nail, 2 competing livery stables, a telegraph office, and a jail that Sheriff Samuel Colt ran with a firm hand, and a reputation for fairness that had kept the town from the kind of violence that had swallowed 3 neighboring settlements whole. Priscilla Payne had arrived 8 months ago in the back of a freighter's wagon with a single leather trunk, a box of medical supplies, and a certificate from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania that made half the town deeply suspicious and the other half cautiously hopeful. Redstone Flats had been without a proper doctor for 14 months after old Doc Hensley had died of a heart ailment that, as Priscilla would later observe with the dry, unsentimental candor that became her signature, he probably could have treated himself if he had listened to his own advice about tobacco. She had set up her practice in the two-room building beside the telegraph office, painted her name on the board outside, and on her very first week had set a broken arm belonging to rancher Pete Hollies that two other men had previously failed to set correctly. Pete Hollies rode back to his ranch with the arm wrapped properly, and told every person he encountered on the road that the new doctor in Redstone Flats had hands like a surgeon and a mind like a steel trap, and that she was also, he added, as an afterthought that would cause considerable discussion, as pretty as a Colorado sunrise. Priscilla herself would have found that description both irrelevant and faintly irritating. She was 27 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned back with a severity that suggested she had long ago decided that looking professional was more important than looking appealing, dark green eyes that catalogued everything they observed, and a mouth that seemed designed by nature for saying difficult truths directly and without softening. She was also, though she never would have admitted it and actively resisted all evidence to the contrary, completely alone in a way that had nothing to do with population, and everything to do with the particular loneliness of being a woman who had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to fit neatly into any category the world offered her. She had met Samuel Colt on her third day in Redstone Flats, when he had come to her door with a deputy named Aaron Fitch, who had caught a piece of broken glass across the palm of his hand during a saloon altercation the night before. The wound was not serious, but it was deep enough to need proper stitching, and someone had apparently informed the sheriff that the new doctor was in residence. Priscilla had cleaned and stitched Aaron Fitch's hand with the calm efficiency she brought to everything, explained the care required to prevent infection, charged a fair price, and then looked up to find Samuel Colt watching her with an expression of focused attention that she had initially interpreted as professional assessment, and later, much later, understood had been something else entirely. "You are good at that," he had said. "Yes," she had agreed, because it was true and she saw no reason to be modest about it. He had nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had already suspected, and then he had said, "If you need anything, the sheriff's office is 2 buildings down." "My name is Samuel Colt. I know who you are," she had said. "Everyone in town knows who you are, and you are Dr. Priscilla Payne," he had said. "Yes," she had said again. "I am." He had touched his hat brim and taken Aaron Fitch home. And that should have been the end of a perfectly ordinary professional introduction between two people whose work sometimes overlapped. Except that Samuel Colt had come back the next day with a covered dish from the hotel kitchen, because the woman who ran the hotel had apparently told him that the new doctor had not yet had time to arrange her own provisions and was likely not eating properly. And it was the kind of town where people noticed things like that and did something about them. Priscilla had stared at the covered dish for a long moment and then looked at him. "Did Mrs. Calloway send you?" she had asked. "Mrs. Calloway suggested it," he had said. "I decided." She had taken the dish. She had not known what to do with the distinction he was drawing, so she had set it aside and focused on the food, which was good and hot and exactly what she needed. But the distinction had stayed with her, small and persistent, like a seed dropped into ground that was not yet ready for it. The months that followed built something between them that neither of them had a clean name for. Samuel had a habit of walking past her office on his evening rounds and stopping to knock if her light was still burning late, checking in the way a man checks on something he considers his responsibility. Priscilla had a habit of leaving her door unlocked when she expected a difficult case, because she had learned that having someone nearby who was steady and capable and would not panic made difficult cases easier to manage. They talked. They talked in ways that surprised both of them. About her training in Philadelphia, about the cases she was most proud of, and the ones that still kept her awake, about his years as a deputy in Kansas, before he had taken the sheriff's position in Redstone Flats, about what he had seen there and what he carried from it, about what it meant to do work that was necessary and often thankless and required you to hold your nerve when every instinct wanted to break. They discovered, over the course of those months, that they were very similar people who had arrived at their similarities through entirely different roads. Both had chosen difficult paths because they believed those paths mattered. Both had learned to be hard in the places that required hardness and had discovered, separately and with some pain, that being hard in the necessary places made it difficult to be soft in the ones where softness was appropriate. Both had been alone for so long that the solitude had started to feel like a feature of their personalities rather than a circumstance of their lives. There was also, underneath all of that, a pull between them that was not intellectual or professional or friendly or any other clean and manageable category. It was the kind of pull that built quietly and steadily and became impossible to ignore by the time you noticed it, like a river that has been filling for months and suddenly crests its banks on an otherwise ordinary morning. Priscilla had noticed it first, which was partly because she was observant by training and partly because the thing she had been observing was her own increasingly unsettled response to his presence. She had spent 3 separate evenings in her 4th month in Redstone Flats, working through the problem with the same systematic rigor. She brought to a difficult diagnosis, cataloging symptoms, ruling out alternatives, arriving at a conclusion she found both undeniable and deeply inconvenient. She was falling in love with Samuel Colt, and she could not afford to. The reason she could not afford to was a secret she had carried from Philadelphia like a stone in the bottom of that leather trunk, heavy and constant and hidden under everything else. Her father, Dr. Elias Payne, had been a brilliant and respected physician. He had also, in the last 3 years of his life, accepted bribes from a railroad company to falsify health examinations for workers who were then sent to labor in conditions that killed 6 of them within a year. When the scandal broke, it had broken everything. Her father had died before the legal proceedings concluded, another heart ailment which Priscilla thought, in her darkest moments, might have been the only mercy in the whole story. But the damage to the Payne name had been total and irreversible. Priscilla had survived it. She had survived it by being impeccable, by working twice as hard as anyone around her, by never giving anyone a reason to question her integrity. But she carried the knowledge of her father's betrayal like a wound that would not close, and it had shaped her understanding of herself in ways she was not entirely aware of. She believed, deep down and without articulating it clearly, that the Payne name was damaged goods. That she was damaged goods. That any man who knew the full truth of her history would eventually look at her with the particular expression of a person calculating whether the association was worth the cost. She had kept this secret in Redstone Flats the way she kept all her dangerous things, locked away and accounted for, and never brought into the light. And then, in the 5th month, someone had brought it into the light for her. His name was Gerald Morse, and he had arrived in Redstone Flats as the representative of the Colorado and Western Railroad Company, which was in the process of negotiating a route through the valley that would, depending entirely on who you asked, either bring prosperity and connection to the region, or destroy the small ranches and farms that had built it. He had set himself up in the hotel's best room and begun making the rounds of every person of influence in town, with the carefully calibrated charm of a man who had been trained to make every conversation feel like it was being conducted between equals. Priscilla had encountered him at the church social that passed for Redstone Flat's social calendar that month, and she had disliked him immediately with the quiet certainty she brought to diagnoses that were obvious before she had finished the examination. There was something in the way he looked at people, assessing, calculating, deciding, that reminded her of her father in his worst years, and she had made her excuses and withdrawn as quickly as decency permitted. She had not known that night that Gerald Morse already knew exactly who she was. She had not known that the railroad company had done its homework on the town's residents of influence, and that the researcher they had employed had found the Philadelphia story and flagged it as potentially useful. She had not known any of this until Gerald Morse came to her office, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the church social, and laid it out for her with the smooth, regretful delivery of a man who has practiced the speech. "I have no interest in causing you any harm, Doctor." "Pain," he had said, sitting in the chair across her desk with his hat in his hands. "I want you to understand that. I have great respect for what you have built here. The people of this town rely on you, and that reliance is clearly well placed." He had paused. "But you should also understand that I am aware of the circumstances surrounding your father and the Continental Railway affair. I am aware of the details that were not widely reported at the time. And I am aware that your position in this community depends entirely on the trust that these people place in you." Priscilla had looked at him across her desk with the expression she kept for surgical procedures, completely still, completely controlled, focused entirely on what needed to happen next. "What do you want?" she had asked. "Nothing unreasonable," he had said. Several of the families whose land the proposed route would cross have been resistant to negotiation. The Hollies Ranch, the Brennan property, the Alcott Farm. These are people who trust you. Your support, or at minimum your public neutrality, on the question of the railroad route would carry considerable weight with them. "You want me to influence my patients," she had said, "or stay silent while they make decisions based on incomplete information." "I want your cooperation," he had said, "in exchange for mine." She had told him to get out of her office. He had gone, but the threat had not. It had settled into her days like a contamination, spreading slowly, touching everything. She had found herself reviewing every interaction, every conversation, imagining it reread in the light of the Philadelphia scandal. She had imagined how Samuel would look at her when he found out. She had imagined it with a clarity that was almost physical in its painfulness. Because she knew, by this point, that it was not only her professional standing she was protecting. She was protecting the beginning of something between herself and Samuel Colt that she had not named yet, but that she recognized by its weight and its warmth, and the way the days had started to feel different when he was nearby. She was protecting it by refusing to examine it too closely, in the same way you avoid looking directly at something bright for fear of damaging your ability to see it clearly. She had not told him about Morse. She had not told him about Philadelphia. She had told herself this was because the information was hers to manage, that she did not need rescuing, that the fundamental competence she had built her entire adult life on was more than sufficient to handle one calculating railroad man without involving the sheriff in it. What she had not told herself, because she was not yet quite ready to hear it, was that she was terrified. Not of Morse's threat exactly, but of what would happen to the fragile, unnamed, extraordinary thing between herself and Samuel if the truth came out in the wrong way. The second reason she had decided to leave was connected to the first, though it had arrived separately and with its own specific cruelty. Her cousin in Denver, Margaret, who was practical and kind, and had always treated Priscilla with a matter-of-fact warmth that was the closest thing Priscilla had to family, had written to tell her that the hospital in Denver was looking for physicians and that her name had been put forward. It was a real position, a significant one, with resources and colleagues and the kind of professional infrastructure that a solo practitioner in a small mountain town could only dream of. It was also. Priscilla had told herself at 3 in the morning for several consecutive nights, a way out. A clean one. A way to leave before Morse's threat became a scandal, before the thing with Samuel became something she would have to either pursue or refuse, before she was forced to make the choice she had been avoiding for months. She had written back to Margaret. She had said yes. And then, because she had been raised to do difficult things with honesty, and because she genuinely cared about these people, she had gone to the general store on a bright October morning to say goodbye. She had not expected Samuel to be there. She had not expected what he would say. She had not expected the way it would make her feel when he said it. When she walked out of the general store that morning with every eye in Redstone Flats following her back, Samuel Colt fell into step beside her with the quiet inevitability of a man who has already decided what the next several hours are going to look like and has made his peace with the decision. He did not speak immediately, which was characteristic of him. He was a man who thought before he spoke, always, and she had come to recognize the value of that in a world full of people who did the opposite. "Walk with me," he said finally, when they had gone half a block. "I have packing to complete," she said. "You can pack later," he said. "Walk with me first." She stopped walking and turned to face him. They were standing in the full autumn morning light, the kind of Colorado light that is impossibly clear at this altitude, and she could see his face with a precision that made it hard to look at and impossible to look away from. He was 32 years old, with the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor work and difficult decisions, and a fundamental honesty that made it more interesting than purely handsome, with dark eyes that she had noticed early on, did something very specific when they were looking at her that they did not do when they were looking at anything else. "Samuel," she said, "there is nothing you can say that changes this." "Then it will not hurt to let me try," he said. She looked at him for 3 more seconds and then she started walking again, which was not the same as agreeing but was not refusing either. He walked beside her, and after another half-block, he guided her with a gentle hand not quite at her elbow, close, but not touching, toward the path behind the church that led to the small creek that ran along the town's eastern edge. It was the place people went when they needed to say something private, which everyone in Redstone Flats understood implicitly. They reached the creek bank, and the sounds of the town softened behind them. Priscilla stood with her arms folded, not in defensiveness but in the particular self-contained posture she adopted when she was preparing for something difficult. "Tell me why," Samuel said. "I told you in the store," she said. "I have an opportunity in Denver, a proper hospital. Resources I do not have here." "That is the reason you told the town," he said. "Tell me the real one." She looked at him sharply. "That is presumptuous." "Probably," he said. "Tell me anyway." The morning light on the creek made small mirrors of moving water. A pair of magpies had a disagreement in the cottonwood above them, and relocated. Priscilla unfolded her arms and pressed one hand flat against her sternum for a moment, a gesture he had seen her make before, once, when a patient she had been unable to save was carried out of her office, and the sight of it did something complicated to his chest. "There is a man named Gerald Morse," she said. "He came to see me 7 weeks ago." Samuel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes became very focused and very still. "Go on," he said. She told him everything. All of it. Philadelphia, her father, the scandal, the years she had spent building her reputation back from the wreckage, Morse's visit, his threat, the Denver letter, the 3 weeks of sleepless decision-making that had ended with her standing in the general store that morning. She told it cleanly and without decoration, the way she reported findings, factual, complete, in the right order. When she finished, she looked at him and waited for the calculation she had been dreading, the quiet reassessment she had been imagining for 7 weeks. What she saw instead was anger. Clean, focused, very controlled anger, the kind that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. "He threatened you," Samuel said. "He presented me with conditions," she said. "He threatened you," Samuel said again, with the quiet certainty of a man who calls things what they are. "Priscilla, why did you not come to me?" "Because I do not need rescuing," she said, and her voice cracked very slightly on the last word, which she had not intended. "I know you do not need rescuing," he said immediately, and there was no impatience in it, no condescension. "I know that. I have known that since the first week you were here. That is not what I am offering." "Then what are you offering?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The creek moved. A breeze came off the mountains with the first cold edge of the season in it. "I am offering you someone to stand with," he said. "Not in front of, not behind. With." Priscilla looked at him, and something she had been holding very tightly for a very long time shifted in her chest. It did not let go entirely, but it shifted. "The thing about my father," she said, slowly, carefully. "The thing that people do not understand, because the newspaper accounts were about the bribery and the workers, which is right. Those were the real harm of it. But the thing that no account touched was that he was also, for most of my life, a genuinely good physician. He saved lives, many of them. And then he made choices at the end that were catastrophically wrong. And I have spent every day since then trying to understand how both things can be true of a single person, and what it means for the person who carries their name." "It means you are not him," Samuel said quietly. "I know that," she said. "In my mind I know that completely. But in the part of me that gets up every morning and faces this town and asks these people to trust me with their lives, I am terrified that they will look at me someday the way I imagine them looking at him." "Priscilla," Samuel said, and his voice was so steady and so warm that it was almost hard to hear it clearly. "There is not a single person in this town who trusts you less than completely. Not one. I know because it is my job to know this town, and I am telling you, they do not just trust your medicine. They trust you. Do you understand the difference?" She looked at him for a long time. "Gerald Morse could take that away," she said. "Gerald Morse," Samuel said, "is going to have a conversation with me this afternoon." "Samuel, not a violent one," he said. "A legal one. There are 2 things I know about men like Morse. The first is that the threat they carry is almost always thinner than it appears, because the moment they have to actually use it, it costs them as much as it costs you. The second is that they are counting on you not calling their hand." He paused. "What he described to you is extortion. I cannot prove that conversation happened, and we both know it. But what I can do is make it clear to him that this town has a sheriff who is paying close attention to his activities, and that any further attempts to pressure its residents will be treated as the criminal conduct it is." Priscilla was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You said over my watch in the store." "I did," he said. "What did you mean by it?" she asked. The question landed between them with a weight that neither of them pretended not to feel. Samuel looked at her steadily, and she noticed, as she had noticed before and always tried not to linger on, that when he looked at her with that particular quality of attention, it made her feel both seen and steady, which was a combination she had not experienced before, and had not known she needed. "I meant," he said carefully, "that I am not prepared to watch you leave this town for reasons that are not truly yours, that I believe you built something here that you deserve to keep, that I believe you deserve to stay somewhere that has learned to see you clearly." He paused. "And I meant other things as well, which I think you are aware of, and which I would like to discuss with you once the immediate problem of Gerald Morse has been resolved." A long silence. The creek, the mountains beyond, the sound of Redstone Flats continuing its mourning in the middle distance. "All right," Priscilla said finally. "All right, you will stay?" he asked. "All right, you may go speak to Gerald Morse," she said. "I make no promises about Denver yet. I want to see what happens." He accepted this with a nod, because it was honest and he valued honesty above almost everything else. "Then do not pack today," he said. "I will not pack today," she said. They walked back toward town together, and if they were closer together on the return walk than they had been on the way out, neither of them remarked on it. Samuel Colt found Gerald Morse exactly where he expected to, in the hotel dining room, eating a late breakfast with the comfortable ease of a man who considers himself beyond accountability. He pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited, placed his hat on the table between them, and gave Morse the full weight of his undivided attention. Morse looked up from his eggs with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to show nothing, but his hand stilled on his fork for just a moment, and Samuel noted it. "Sheriff," Morse said pleasantly. "What can I do for you? You can listen," Samuel said. "Which I suspect you are skilled at when you choose to be." He did not raise his voice. He did not make any threat that could be repeated to anyone else. He also said, very quietly and at the end, "Dr. Payne is a person of exceptional professional and personal character whose standing in this community is beyond question. If you have formed any other impression, I suggest you revise it." Morse looked at him for a long moment, performing the calculation Priscilla had predicted, weighing the cost of the threat against the cost of using it. Then he picked up his fork again and cut a piece of egg with the exaggerated calm of a man who has decided to retreat but will not be seen doing it. "I appreciate the clarity, Sheriff," Morse said. "I find that clear communication is always preferable to misunderstanding." "I could not agree more," Samuel said. He stood up, put his hat back on, and left the dining room. That afternoon, Gerald Morse sent a telegram to his employers in Denver that was, by all subsequent evidence, less optimistic about the prospects for the Eastern Valley route than his previous communications had been. He left Redstone Flats 3 days later without approaching Priscilla again. The railroad eventually chose a different route through a northern pass, which suited the ranchers and farmers of the valley enormously, and became a point of local pride that was still being discussed at the Copper Nail well into the following decade. But none of that was known yet. The afternoon that Samuel returned from his conversation with Morse and stopped at Priscilla's office door, she was at her desk, which she always was in the slow afternoons, working through case notes with the systematic attention she gave to everything. She looked up when he knocked, and something in the quality of his expression told her that the conversation had gone the way he intended. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well enough," he said. "Did you threaten him?" she asked. "I clarified the legal landscape," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then, slowly, the expression she kept so carefully controlled in professional situations relaxed into something that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. The specific expression of a person who has been holding a very heavy thing and has just been offered, tentatively, a place to set it down. "Thank you," she said. "I told you I was not offering rescue," he said. "You also told me you were offering to stand with me," she said. "You did that, so I am thanking you for it." He took his hat off and held it, which was something he only did when he was uncertain, and she had learned to read his uncertainty the same way she read everyone else's physical tells, with attention and without judgment. "Priscilla," he said, "the other things I mentioned at the creek." "I remember," she said. "I would like to be direct," he said. "I would prefer that," she said, strongly. He took a breath, the kind that precedes something difficult to say, not because it is not true, but because saying it makes it irreversible. "I have been in love with you since about the 3rd month you were in this town," he said. "I have been managing it carefully for the past 5 months because I was not certain you wanted me to say so, and because you had enough to contend with professionally without me adding to it. But watching you stand up in that store this morning and prepare to leave," he stopped. "I am not prepared for this town without you in it, and I am not prepared for my life without you in it either. I think you should know that." Priscilla set her pen down. She looked at him for a long moment, with the full force of those dark green eyes that catalogued everything they observed. And what she was doing, he understood, was looking at him the way she looked at a diagnosis she had already arrived at, but needed to examine one more time before she was willing to say it aloud. "I have been in love with you since approximately the same time," she said finally. "Possibly earlier. I have been managing it with similar care and for different but equally insufficient reasons." The silence that followed was one of the most extraordinary silences either of them had ever sat inside. Full rather than empty, electric with everything that had been moving underneath the surface of their interactions for months, and was now, finally, permitted to be where it actually was. He crossed the room. She stood up. They met somewhere in the middle of the small office, close enough that she had to look up to keep looking at him, which she did, steadily and without the armor she wore for everything else. When he reached up and touched her face, cupping her jaw with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a man who understands he is handling something of enormous importance, she closed her eyes for just a moment, the way people close their eyes when something is almost too good to look directly at. "Do not leave," he said softly. "I am not leaving," she said, and meant it with every part of herself. When he kissed her, it was with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, full and unhurried and completely present. And she kissed him back with the completeness of a person who has stopped managing and started feeling, which was its own kind of extraordinary. They stood there in the small afternoon office for a long time after, her hands folded into his, both of them slightly astonished by the size of the thing they had just stepped into, which felt entirely right and somewhat terrifying in the particular way that all important things feel. "I should write to Margaret," Priscilla said eventually. "Yes," he said. "She will be very smug about it," Priscilla said. "She has been encouraging me to stay in Redstone Flats since approximately my 2nd month here. She said, and I quote, that she could hear in my letters that I had found a place that fit me." "She sounds perceptive," Samuel said. "She is insufferably perceptive," Priscilla said, and there was warmth in it that had nothing to do with complaint. He was still holding her hands. "I want to do this properly," he said. "I want to court you properly the way you deserve. And then, when the time is right, I would very much like to ask you a specific question." She looked at him with a directness that made him feel he had been read completely, which was somehow not uncomfortable at all. "I anticipate," she said carefully, "that my answer to that question will not require much deliberation." "Good," he said, and the word came out rougher and quieter than he intended, and she did not mind that at all. Redstone Flats, which had been watching this particular development with the combined interest of 300 people who had been waiting for it to happen since approximately Priscilla's 4th month in town, reacted to the new state of affairs with the specific satisfaction of a community whose collective instincts have been validated. Mrs. Calloway at the hotel set extra dessert aside whenever they came in for dinner. Aaron Fitch told everyone at the Copper Nail that he had seen it coming from the very first time he had watched the sheriff look at the doctor while she was stitching his hand. Pete Hollis said, somewhat inaccurately but with great conviction, that he had told everyone from the beginning that this would happen. The courtship was genuine and unhurried in a way that was exactly right for who they both were. Samuel called at her office in the evenings with the same regularity he had always had. Except now the purpose of the visits was acknowledged between them, and the conversations that had always been easy and interesting became something more layered and more intimate. He took her riding on Sundays when her patient schedule permitted, out into the valley where the mountain views made ordinary conversation feel insufficient, and the silence between them was comfortable in the particular way that only deep familiarity produces. He listened with the quality of attention that was one of his most distinctive features, asking questions that went to the heart of things, understanding what mattered. She learned, in those same conversations, the parts of his history he had held back. He had grown up in Kansas, the third of 4 children, on a farm that had been repeatedly threatened by drought and debt, and once, memorably, by a group of claim jumpers whose arrival had precipitated the only act of serious violence in Samuel's early life, which he had been 16 years old, and had handled with a decisive physical effectiveness that had later been identified by everyone in his life as the first sign that he was going to be a lawman. He had become a deputy at 20, worked his way to sheriff's positions in 2 Kansas counties before Redstone Flats had recruited him at 29, with the specific mandate of cleaning up a town that had been sliding toward genuine lawlessness in the vacuum left by its previous sheriff's incapacity. He had done that work well, but it had cost him things, opportunities for the kind of private life that other men built in their 20s, relationships that could not survive the demands of the job, years that had passed in useful, necessary, lonely work that had sometimes felt more like a sentence than a vocation. "You love it, though," Priscilla said, one Sunday evening on the ridge above the valley, watching the last light go out of the sky. "I love it," he confirmed. "I also love having something to come back to." She leaned against his shoulder very slightly. Not dramatically, not making a ceremony of it, just the small physical acknowledgement of what he had said. And he put his arm around her with the natural ease of a man who has found a thing that fits and intends to keep it. It was 6 weeks after the morning in the general store, with the first snow of the year light on the peaks above them, and the valley turning the amber and rust of deep autumn, that Samuel Colt asked Priscilla Payne to marry him. He had, in accordance with his promise to do things properly, spoken to Margaret in Denver first by telegram, and received a response that he described to Priscilla as enthusiastic to the point of alarming, which Priscilla said was extremely characteristic of her cousin. He asked her on the bank of the small creek where they had first said the important things, because it seemed right to mark the place. He did not go down on one knee, which she privately appreciated, because she had always found the gesture slightly theatrical, and he had clearly understood this without being told. He held her hands and looked at her with the full, direct, unguarded openness that he only had for her, and asked her, in plain and straightforward language, whether she would be his wife. She said yes in the same register, plain, direct, completely certain. And then she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him with a thoroughness that would have surprised the town's more conservative residents if they had been there to observe it, which fortunately they were not. They were married at the church that doubled as a schoolhouse on the second Saturday of November, 1882, in a ceremony that the Reverend Aldridge described afterwards as the most emotionally satisfying service he had conducted in 15 years of ministry, which he meant as a compliment to the evident sincerity of the participants. Margaret came down from Denver for the occasion and spent the entire ceremony with the expression of a woman whose instincts have been completely vindicated, and spent the celebration afterward being warmly insufferable about it. The wedding was simple and real and entirely characteristic of both of them. No elaborate ceremony, no excess sentiment, but an honesty in the exchange of their promises that made several attendees, including Pete Hollis, who was not a sentimental man by any measure, find reasons to look at the floor for a moment. Priscilla kept her practice. This was never a question between them, and never became one. Samuel had understood from the first that her medicine was not a temporary arrangement but the center of her vocation, and he supported it with the same matter-of-fact steadiness with which he supported everything he believed in. She was, if anything, busier in the months following the wedding, as the town's population slowly grew and her reputation for thorough, honest medical care drew patients from the surrounding ranches and occasionally from neighboring settlements. She moved her practice into a larger space the following spring, a proper 2-room office with a dedicated examination room and a small dispensary, which Samuel helped her equip with the same focused competence he brought to equipping his jail. She organized it exactly as she wanted it, and he deferred to her completely on every decision with a cooperative ease that she found, after years of fighting for professional autonomy, almost disorienting in its simplicity. They lived in the house on the edge of town that had come with his position, a solid wood frame structure with a covered porch that faced the mountains and a kitchen large enough to be useful. And they made it into a home with the gradual, unforced accumulation of shared life. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring. He built her a proper bookshelf for the medical texts that had been stacked against every wall of the office. They had real arguments occasionally about real things, her frustration with his tendency to minimize physical risks to himself on the job, his concern about her hours and the toll they took. And they had the arguments directly and honestly, and resolved them without residue, which was characteristic of both of them and which kept the house from accumulating the kind of quiet resentments that poison most ordinary dwellings. The following winter, in December of 1883, Priscilla discovered she was expecting a child. She did her own assessment first, with the clinical thoroughness she brought to every examination, and then she sat with the result for about 45 minutes before going to find Samuel, who was at the jail doing the paperwork that occupied most of his afternoons. She knocked on the door frame and he looked up from his desk. "I have a finding to report," she said, and something in her voice made him set down his pen. She told him. He was very still for a moment, and then the expression that moved across his face was so unguarded and so complete in its joy that she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was still tight. "You are certain," he said, not as doubt but as a man checking his most important findings twice. "I am certain," she said. "Approximately 15 weeks along, which would put the arrival in late April or early May." He stood up from the desk, came around it, and pulled her into his arms with a gentleness and a completeness that she had learned to simply receive in those 2 years since the creek, without the old automatic instinct to manage from a safe distance. She pressed her face into his shoulder for a moment and felt him breathe. "A spring child," he said. "A spring child," she agreed, her voice somewhat muffled against his coat. The pregnancy was, by Priscilla's own medical assessment, entirely routine, which she documented with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to her patients, and which amused Samuel deeply. She set aside a portion of her practice in the final months, took on a second physician, a young man named Dr. Thomas Riley, who had graduated from a medical college in St. Louis and was eager for practical experience to handle her caseload. She told Samuel with absolute conviction, not planning to be incapacitated by a normal physiological process. He told her that he entirely believed her, and also that he was going to make sure she ate adequately and slept sufficiently regardless, because he was not planning to let her manage this by herself, which was a statement so characteristic of everything they had built that she was not even mildly annoyed by it. Their son was born on the morning of May 3rd, 1884, in the bedroom of the house on the edge of town, with Dr. Riley in attendance and Samuel present, because Priscilla had told him she wanted him there, and he had not for one moment considered being anywhere else. It was a long labor but an uncomplicated one, and when it was over and the boy was in her arms, red-faced and extraordinarily loud about his arrival, Priscilla looked at him with an expression she had never worn before. Not quite the calm competence of the doctor, not quite the measured certainty of the woman who had built her life on proven things, but something older and more primal and more complete than either. "He has your eyes," she said to Samuel. Samuel was sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand on her back, looking at the boy with an expression that was going to embarrass him if anyone else ever described it accurately. "He has your determination," he said. "Look at that frown." "That is not a frown," she said. "That is concentration." "He is 2 minutes old," Samuel said. "He is already assessing his situation," Priscilla said with complete conviction. They named him Elias after her father, which was a decision Priscilla had made carefully and with full intention. She had explained it to Samuel simply. Her father had been a flawed man who had made catastrophic choices, but he had also been the person who had first put a medical text in her hands when she was 8 years old and told her that minds like hers were not meant for small lives. She was not naming her son for the failure. She was naming him for the thread of genuine good that had run through even the damaged life, and for the act of claiming her own history rather than being claimed by it. Samuel had understood this immediately, as he understood most things about her, not by analysis but by genuine attention to who she was. The town received young Elias Colt with the enthusiasm of a community that had been following his parents' story since before they were his parents, and Mrs. Calloway immediately established a permanent practice of sending over food from the hotel kitchen whenever the new parents looked like they had not had time to cook, which was frequent enough in the first months to be genuinely useful. Pete Hollies arrived with what he described as an educational toy for the boy, and turned out to be a small hand-carved horse that was almost certainly more craft than toy, and which Priscilla placed on the bookshelf above the child's crib, with the specific care she reserved for things of actual value. Samuel's work continued through all of this with its characteristic rhythm: the daily rounds, the occasional serious situations, the steady management of a town that was growing and changing in ways that required constant and attentive navigation. In the mid-1880s, the frontier was in a complex and often painful transition, the old patterns of land and settlement being renegotiated in ways that were frequently unjust to the communities that had been there longest. And Samuel's role in Redstone Flats required him to hold a line that was sometimes uncomfortable between the law as written and the justice that the law was supposed to serve. He did not always manage this perfectly. There were decisions that kept him awake, choices that satisfied the letter of his mandate while troubling the spirit of it. He talked to Priscilla about these things in the evenings, when Elias was asleep and the house was quiet, and she brought to these conversations the same rigor she brought to difficult medical cases. not softening the complexity, but helping him think through it, asking the questions that sharpened his thinking without simply validating his inclinations. It was the quality of their partnership that surprised both of them most in the years that followed. Not the passion of it, which was real and sustaining, but the intellectual and moral quality of it. They had, between them, two highly trained minds applied to different disciplines, and the way those minds worked together produced something neither of them had had access to before, and that both of them had been quietly hungry for without knowing it. By the autumn of 1885, with Elias approaching his second year and already exhibiting the combination of focused attention and absolute physical fearlessness that had apparently been inevitable given his parentage, Priscilla's practice had grown to the point where she and Dr. Riley were genuinely stretched, and she was writing to the Women's Medical College about the possibility of a second additional physician. The town had grown with the railroad, which had eventually come through a different route, but still increased traffic and commerce and population. And with growth came the full spectrum of human difficulty that growth always produces, which kept both the doctor and the sheriff fully occupied. Samuel had been offered a position in Denver twice by this point, a higher-ranking position with better pay and considerably more political profile, and had declined it both times. He had declined it because Redstone Flats was his town, in the specific way that a place becomes yours when you have built something in it worth protecting. He had also declined it because Priscilla's practice was here, and their home was here, and their son was here, and the life they had made was rooted in this place in ways he was not interested in transplanting. Priscilla had not told him not to go. She had asked him, clearly and directly, whether he wanted the Denver positions, and he had said no with a certainty that required no elaboration. And she had believed him because he was incapable of telling her anything that was not true. The spring of 1886 brought a second pregnancy, which Priscilla announced to Samuel in the same manner as the first, as a clinical finding that she had verified thoroughly and was now reporting. He responded in essentially the same way: stillness, complete joy, the unguarded expression he only had for things that mattered completely. With the addition of Elias, who was now nearly 2 and present for the conversation, having followed his father into the kitchen from the porch, and who had absolutely no idea what was being discussed, but was enthusiastic about the attention the moment was generating. This daughter arrived in October 1886, which placed her firmly in the autumn she would later claim as her personal characteristic season. And she was named Clara after Samuel's mother, who had died when he was 12 and whose memory he carried with the careful quietness of a man who does not speak about the deepest things often, but means them completely when he does. Priscilla had suggested the name and watched his face when she did, and what she saw there confirmed that it had been exactly right. Clara Colt arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had managed, as though having observed his production value from wherever she had been waiting and decided efficiency was preferable. She was, from the first, a different kind of person than Elias, quieter in her physical presence, watching everything with dark green eyes that were unmistakably her mother's, absorbing the world with a stillness that made pediatric assessment somewhat complicated because you could not always tell what she was thinking. "She is evaluating us," Samuel said on the third day, watching his daughter watch him. "Of course she is," Priscilla said. "She is a sensible child." "She has your diagnostic stare," he said. "She is 3 days old," Priscilla said, but she was looking at Clara with an expression that suggested she was not entirely disagreeing. Their house expanded to accommodate its additional person with the practical efficiency that characterized everything in that household. Elias proved to be the kind of older sibling who treated Clara's existence as an extremely interesting new development that he had strong opinions about, including strong opinions about what she should and should not be allowed to do, which Priscilla managed with consistent and loving firmness, and Samuel managed with the calm authority he brought to all situations where the rules needed to be clear without being cruel. In those years between 1884 and 1888, the house on the edge of town with the mountain view became the kind of place that people later remembered when they remembered Redstone Flats in its best years. It was not the grandest house in town or the most elaborate, but it had a quality to it. The full bookshelves, the kitchen garden that Priscilla maintained with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, the porch where Samuel spent Sunday mornings with coffee and the week's newspaper, the constant specific atmosphere of a home that was actively and intentionally loved by everyone in it. Mrs. Calloway, who had a proprietary interest in the whole situation going back to the covered dish that had been the first act of the whole story, told her sister that the Colt household was the most genuinely happy place she had encountered in 40 years of making careful observations about households, and that the most remarkable thing about it was that neither of them seemed to require an audience for it. The happiness was not performed. It was just there, all the time, in the particular way that things are when they have been properly built. They had arguments. They had weeks of difficult professional strain that came home on both sets of shoulders, and had to be managed carefully so as not to become unfairly directed. They had the ordinary accumulated weight of a life that included 2 small children, demanding vocations, and a community that needed things from both of them constantly. None of this was invisible or ignored or managed with the pretense that it did not exist. But underneath all of it, permanent and navigable, was the thing they had found at the creek that October morning in 1882, the extraordinary, ordinary fact of having found someone to stand with, not in front of, not behind, with. And what that meant in practice, across the years and the seasons and the ordinary, extraordinary days of a real life, was that nothing was too heavy to be carried, and nothing was too hard to be said, and nothing was faced alone, ever, by either of them. Redstone Flats grew through the late 1880s with the Western expansion, acquiring a proper school and a second church and a train depot when the feeder line finally came through in 1887, and the town that had seemed like a temporary stopping place to more than one of its early residents became, quietly and without making a ceremony of it, a place worth staying. The kind of place that held its people by giving them something to be part of. Gerald Morse never returned to Redstone Flats, which was a fact that Priscilla acknowledged once. On the anniversary of the morning she had stood in the general store and said she was leaving, with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has faced a threat and refused to be defined by it. "I think about it sometimes," she told Samuel on the porch that evening, with Elias asleep and Clara making the small, determined sounds she made when she was fighting sleep. "What would have happened if you had not been outside the store that morning?" "I was always going to be outside the store that morning," he said. "You could not have known I was going to be there," she said. "No," he said. "But I walk past the store every morning, so I was going to be there. And you were going to be there, and it was going to happen the way it happened." He paused. "I believe some things are as much about timing as anything else." "That is not a very scientific position," she said. "I am a lawman," he said. "I have more latitude than you do." She leaned her head against his shoulder on the porch in the October night, listening to the mountains and the town, and said, "I am glad I did not leave." "I know," he said. "I was going to, though," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I had genuinely decided. I was not waiting to be stopped. I know that too, he said. What would you have done if I had been further along? She asked. If I had already left before you had the chance to speak? I would have followed you to Denver, he said simply. She lifted her head to look at him. You would have left your post. I would have requested a temporary leave and followed you to Denver and told you the same things I told you at the creek, and then I would have come back to my post, he said. Or, if you had preferred Denver, I would have seen about the deputy sheriff position there. You looked into the Denver deputy position, she said. I looked into it early, he said, before I knew how the morning was going to go, as a contingency. She was quiet for a moment. That is extremely characteristic of you, she said. Is it a problem? He asked. It is the furthest thing from a problem, she said, and kissed his jaw, which was where her mouth landed without effort when they were sitting like this, which she had long since decided was simply the correct geometry of the situation. The years settled into the deep and satisfying rhythm of a life well made. Elias at 6 was already showing the systematic curiosity that his mother brought to everything and the steady physical confidence that was his father's. And he had developed a specific interest in the workings of the natural world that occupied most of his waking hours, and a significant portion of his parents' patience in the best possible way. Clara at 4 was still watching everything, still absorbing the world with those dark green evaluating eyes, and had recently begun demonstrating a facility with language that made Priscilla look at her, sometimes with the specific expression of a person watching something extraordinary in its early stages. The town watched them both the way a community watches children who belong to it, with proprietary affection and the particular pleasure of seeing the next generation shaped by people who had shaped the place itself. Samuel taught Elias to ride with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, and Elias proved to be his father's son in this as in much else, determined, careful, unafraid. Priscilla took Clara to her office, sometimes in the afternoons when Dr. Riley handled the morning cases, and Clara sat very quietly in the corner watching with the expression that everyone now recognized as her characteristic state, and Priscilla would explain in age-appropriate terms what she was doing, and Clara would ask, occasionally, a question so precise and well-aimed that even Dr. Riley started raising his eyebrows. The practice had by now become something that Priscilla could look at with the satisfaction of a thing properly built, not because it was flawless or without difficulty, but because it was genuinely useful, because the lives of the people in this valley were measurably better for its existence, because the work she had chosen with such determined clarity 15 years earlier had fulfilled its promise in the specific place she had almost left. In the spring of 1889, with the Colorado statehood discussions filling the newspapers and the territory in a moment of forward-looking energy that carried its own particular quality of possibility, Samuel came home one evening with the specific expression Priscilla had learned to read as, "I have been thinking about something significant." She was at the kitchen table reviewing case notes while Clara occupied herself with the blocks Elias had largely graduated from, and Elias read a book about the natural history of North American rivers, with the complete absorption he brought to things that interested him. Samuel sat down, accepted the coffee she poured without asking because she always knew when he wanted it, and looked at her across the table. "I have been thinking about what comes next," he said. "In general?" she asked. "In specific," he said. "The territory is going to be a state soon. The political landscape is going to change. The kind of law enforcement this town needs is going to need to change with it." He paused. "I think it might be time to think about training someone, building something that doesn't depend entirely on one person." She looked at him. "You are thinking about what comes after the sheriff's position," she said. Not immediately after, he said. But yes, eventually after. What would come after? She asked. I don't know exactly, he said. But I have been thinking that there are ways to work on justice that are not exclusively about carrying a badge. The law is changing. The territory needs people who understand both the practical work and the broader principles. I have been corresponding with a man at the University of Colorado about their law program. Priscilla looked at him for a long moment. You want to study law, she said. I want to think about it, he said, as a future possibility, as a thing that might allow me to do this work at a different level. She was quiet for a moment, processing this with the thoroughness she brought to important information. Then she said, I think that is an excellent instinct and I think you should pursue it. It would not be immediate, he said, and it would not require us to leave Redstone Flats necessarily, depending on how it is structured. I know, she said, but even if it did eventually require some movement, we would manage that. She looked at him steadily. Samuel, you have spent 10 years holding this town together with both hands. You have the right to build what comes next. He looked at her with the expression she found most characteristic of him at his most real, not the professional steadiness or the sheriff's authority, but the person underneath, who was still occasionally surprised to be as loved as he was, and received it each time as though it was new. I married a remarkable woman, he said. You did, she agreed. And she married a remarkable man, which she recommends to all her patients as an excellent prescription for long-term health. He laughed, which was a sound that still had the power, after all these years, to make the room feel different. Elias looked up from his book of rivers. Clara knocked over her blocks and looked at them with the evaluating expression that everyone recognized, decided the new configuration was acceptable, and moved on. Priscilla received this news with unqualified pride, which she expressed in the characteristically direct manner that was one of the things he loved most about her. Not with elaborate celebration, but with a clear, warm, "This is exactly right, and I am very proud of you," said over the dinner table in front of their children, which was the register in which the most important things in that household were said. Life in Redstone Flats continued in all its complexity and richness through those years of the late 1880s and into the 1890s. The town grew further. New families arrived. Old families expanded. The school that had begun as a church doubling as a classroom became a proper building with a dedicated teacher and enough students to run proper grade levels. The train depot brought commerce and connection, and also the regular arrival of newspapers from Denver and Chicago that kept the town's debates lively and well-informed. Dr. Thomas Riley, who had come as a young physician eager for experience, stayed and became a permanent and essential part of the medical practice, which Priscilla reorganized in 1890 as a proper partnership. She also, in that same year, began traveling quarterly to Denver to contribute to the State Medical Association's Committee on Standards for Frontier Medical Practice, which was work she found deeply engaging, and which gave her a professional community beyond Redstone Flats that had its own specific value. Samuel, who took these quarterly trips with the equanimity of a man who both understood their importance and was entirely at ease with his wife's professional independence, managed the household and the children during her absences with the same competent steadiness he brought to everything. And Elias and Clara, who were used to both parents being capable of running the home because both of them always had been, took their mother's quarterly absences as simply a feature of their reality. "Your mother is the most competent person I know," Samuel told Elias once when the boy was 8 and had expressed, with the philosophical directness of childhood, that he wished she was home more sometimes. "More than you?" Elias asked. It is not a competition, Samuel said. But yes, in most areas. But you are the sheriff, Elias said, and she is the doctor, Samuel said. These are different skills. The town needs both. She and I need each other for different reasons. That is the thing to understand. Elias thought about this with the expression he had inherited directly from his father, focused, honest, working through the reasoning. She misses us when she is in Denver, he said finally. Very much, Samuel said, and we miss her. That is what it is like to love someone who has important work in the world. You hold the missing and you wait for them to come home. Elias nodded as though this were a principle he intended to store and apply later. Clara, who had been sitting 3 feet away and appeared to be absorbed in her own activity, said without looking up, I knew that already. Samuel looked at his daughter and then looked at the ceiling briefly, and then said, I know you did, Clara. Priscilla came home from Denver on these trips the way a person comes home from something genuinely nourishing, full rather than depleted, bringing the energy of the wider world back into the household with her. She would sit with Samuel on the porch in the evenings after the children were in bed and tell him everything. The committee debates, the cases she had heard about from other frontier physicians, the political arguments about who had access to medical care and how that should be organized, the conversations with Margaret, who still lived in Denver and remained insufferably perceptive about everything. He told her everything in return, the week's cases from the town, the ongoing negotiations with the county about road maintenance, the slow progress of his reading in legal theory, the specific ways Elias and Clara had respectively impressed and challenged him during her absence. They talked until the mountains went dark, and the first stars came out over the peaks, and the house behind them breathed with the deep, settled quiet of a place that has been made into a home by sustained and intentional love. The clinic served 47 people on its first day of operation, including 3 serious conditions that had gone unaddressed for years due to lack of access. And Priscilla came home that evening in the specific state she entered after days of sustained and significant work, bone-tired and lit up from the inside in a way that was completely distinctive, and that Samuel had loved from the first time he had ever seen it. He had dinner ready, the children fed and doing their evening tasks, the house quiet. He sat across from her at the kitchen table while she ate and listened to everything she told him about the day, asking the questions that kept her talking and let her decompress, which was the particular service she needed, and that he provided with the attentiveness of someone who has paid careful attention to what the person they love actually needs. 47, she said for the 4th time, because the number still seemed to her to deserve saying. 47, he agreed. And we only missed 2 cases I think we should have caught. In a first-run clinic, he said, which is not an excuse, she said, which is a context, he said. Next time you will catch them, because you will specifically look for them. That is how it works. She looked at him. How do you always know what to say? She asked. I do not always know what to say, he said. I know what to say to you, which is different. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a moment in the evening quiet, with the children's sounds from elsewhere in the house and the mountains outside the window, and the full weight of their life settled around them like something warm. He brought this to Priscilla in the same way she had once brought him her findings, as a fact to be examined together, with all its implications laid out clearly, and nothing managed to protect the other person from the difficulty of it. It would require time in Denver, he said. Not permanent residence, but regular periods, 2 weeks per month potentially. Similar to my quarterly trips, she said, thinking through it. Yes, he said, and possibly resulting eventually in a transition away from the day-to-day sheriff's position. I have already spoken to Deputy Hendricks about his readiness to take on more responsibility." He paused. "I want to know what you think." "I think," Priscilla said carefully, "that 10 years ago you stood in a general store and told a woman she was not leaving this town. And I think the reason you did that was that you had already understood, without quite having the words for it yet, that what this town needed was not someone who had decided to stay, but someone who had actively chosen it." She looked at him. "I think you have actively chosen this place and these people for 10 years, and I think the work you could do at the state level is a continuation of that choosing, not an abandonment of it. I think you should take the position." "It changes things," he said. "Most good things do," she said. He took the position. The transition was managed over the course of 1892 and 1893, with Deputy Hendricks growing into the sheriff's role with the competent steadiness that made the handover easier than it might have been, and Samuel establishing himself in the state-level advisory work with the combination of practical knowledge and principled thinking that made him exactly as useful there as he had expected to be. The household reorganized itself around the new rhythm with the practical flexibility that had always characterized it. Both Samuel and Priscilla were traveling regularly now, which required coordination and sometimes creative management of the children's schedules, which Elias and Clara navigated with the adaptive capability of children who have been raised to understand that meaningful work requires accommodation, and that their parents' vocations were meaningful. There were harder weeks and easier ones. There were periods when the coordination was imperfect and both of them arrived home in the same week, depleted from separate difficulties, and had to be careful about not transferring those difficulties to each other. There were evenings when the porch conversation was shorter because exhaustion made depth temporarily unavailable, and they let those evenings be what they were without requiring them to be something more. But the foundation was always there, permanent, navigable, proven by years of sustained use. The thing they had found at the creek in 1882 had not simplified with time. Nothing real simplifies with time. But it had deepened in the way that only things which have survived real difficulty genuinely deepen, and the depth of it was the most solid thing either of them had ever stood on. Redstone Flats in 1895 was a different town than the one Priscilla had arrived in 13 years earlier, and also entirely the same. Still 300 souls who knew each other's business. Still the valley turning golden in autumn and brutal in winter. Still the mountains standing their absolute ground above everything human and temporary and small. The general store still had the same bench outside where old Dexter Finch had once frozen mid-page in the Sears catalog, though Dexter himself had died in 1891, and the store was now run by his daughter-in-law with a more organized inventory system. Mrs. Calloway still ran the hotel and still, occasionally, sent food to the Colt household when she judged that circumstances warranted it, though this happened less often now that Elias was 15 and Clara 13, and both were capable of significant domestic contribution. She still considered the whole enterprise of Samuel and Priscilla's marriage to be one of the finest things she had observed in 40 years of careful observation, and said so regularly to anyone who would listen. The Colt household, on a Thursday evening in October 1895, sat down to dinner together with the full warmth of a space that had been consistently and intentionally made into a home. Samuel had returned from Denver the previous evening. Priscilla had not left that week, choosing instead to catch up on the clinic preparations for the annual Autumn Community Medicine Day. Elias, who was beginning to think about his future with the seriousness of a young man who has been raised to take futures seriously, had spent the afternoon at the law office of the town's new attorney, discussing the possibility of reading law after school. Clara had spent the afternoon at the library with 3 books she intended to finish before Sunday, and the kind of focused contentment that was completely characteristic of her. They sat at the kitchen table, all 4 of them, and the conversation moved in the easy, overlapping way of a family that has had thousands of such conversations and knows how to listen as well as speak. Samuel asked Clara about her books, and she told him, in the precise and detailed way she told everything, which required significant attention to follow and repaid that attention with unusual depth. Priscilla asked Elias about the attorney's office, and he answered with the cautious excitement of someone who has just glimpsed a future that fits. And she listened with the expression she wore for things she found genuinely excellent. After dinner, the children cleared the table with the routine efficiency of long-established habit, and Samuel and Priscilla sat with their coffee in the kitchen with the quiet that fell over the house in the transition between the busy and the still. "You ever think about leaving?" Samuel asked. She looked at him with a flash of something that might have been amusement or might have been something older than that. "You mean now, in general," he said. "No," she said simply. "Do you?" "No," he said. "Then why did you ask?" she said. He considered for a moment. "Because I think sometimes about that morning," he said. "And I think about how close it was, how easily it could have been different, and I find myself wanting to name that out loud occasionally, the fact of how good this has been." She looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her expression was not the controlled professional assessment or the careful management of vulnerable feeling that had once been her default setting, but the full, clear, unguarded presence of a woman who has been fully known and fully loved for 13 years, and has learned, gradually and completely, to stand in that without armor. "It has been extraordinary," she said. "From the very beginning, even the hard parts, especially those," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He reached across the table and she took his hand. Outside the window, the mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars, the same mountains that had stood behind the whole story from beginning to middle to this quiet, perfectly ordinary, completely extraordinary evening. Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway, with the particular expression of a teenage boy who has interrupted something without entirely understanding what it was. "Clara says she needs another lamp because the one in the parlor is not bright enough to read by, and she is asking if you can talk to her about it," he said to his father. "I can talk to her about it," Samuel said, without releasing Priscilla's hand. "She has 3 books to finish by Sunday," Elias added helpfully. "I am aware," Samuel said. "She has already finished one," Elias said. "Since this afternoon." Samuel looked at Priscilla. "She is your daughter," he said. "She is emphatically her own person," Priscilla said, "who happens to share some of my characteristics and all of your stubbornness when she is determined about something." "You are describing a perfect combination," he said. "I am describing an unstoppable force," she said. And there was so much love in it that Elias, at 15, who was old enough to recognize what he was looking at even if he could not yet fully articulate it, had the sudden strong sense that he was witnessing something he would want to remember. Samuel stood up, touched Priscilla's face as he passed, the same simple gesture he had first made in her office in 1882 and had made 10,000 times since then, and went to negotiate the lamp situation with Clara, whose determination on the subject of adequate reading light was, everyone in the household had learned, entirely non-negotiable. She had not left, and everything that had come from not leaving was more than she had known to ask for. From the other room, she could hear Samuel's voice and Clara's, the specific back and forth of a father who understands that his daughter is going to win this argument, and is enjoying the process of letting it happen. She could hear Elias in his room, the sounds of a young man organizing his future, books and papers, and the occasional murmured sentence as he worked through something on paper. The house settled around all of it. The mountains held their ground outside. The stars above Redstone Flats were the same stars that had been there before the town, would be there long after, indifferent and beautiful and absolutely reliable, which was its own kind of comfort. Priscilla Payne, who was now Priscilla Colt in the way of a woman who has chosen a new name with full understanding of what she was choosing, finished her coffee in the kitchen of the home she had made with the man she loved in the town she had stayed in, because he had stood up in the general store on an October morning and said, "Over my watch," and had meant every word of it in every direction it could possibly mean. The lamp burned in the parlor. The children were where they were supposed to be. The mountains stood. The stars turned. And in Redstone Flats, Colorado, in the autumn of 1895, the house at the edge of town with the porch that faced the peaks was, as it had been for 13 years, and would be for a very long time to come, exactly what a home should be.